I was 12 years old when we were forced to resettle into the Krakow ghetto. I trembled with such fear and hopelessness as we walked through the narrow, familiar streets into the ghetto, carrying our meager possessions, pulling a pushcart filled with some bedding, a mattress, and some pots and pans. We went over the bridge into our prison behind the high walls, surrounded by armed guards and hundreds of dogs trained to tear us apart. Since adults over 55 and children under 12 were deemed unfit for work, and we believed that work meant life, my parents changed my birthday to make me 2 years older. There were workshops in the ghetto. Some of us were tailors, dressmakers, shoemakers, bootmakers. Others made brooms, brushes, or worked in printing shop. The ghetto was overcrowded and dirty. Several families shared the small rooms. Buildings were old. For many, bathrooms were outside. Water and electricity were only available at certain times. It was hard to keep clean. It was hard to keep warm. There was little food. We were starving. We had no medicine. Sickness and despair were everywhere. Day and night there was more horror, more terror. Soldiers stormed through the streets and the buildings, arresting people. Selections and transports to where? We didn't know. I remember that summer day when there was a roundup and my grandparents couldn't get life permits. I hid with them in the courtyard of our building under bushes and piles of leaves. We stayed there all day, not moving, while the soldiers with their bayonets searched the buildings room by room. At one time, one of the murderers was inches away from my head, but I didn't flinch. Finally, we heard the trucks leaving. The shooting ended. No more barking dogs. Slowly we crawled out from our hiding place, trying not to look suspicious. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the last patrol of the day appeared. They pushed me aside and took my grandparents away. I can still see these dear old people walking away, holding hands, never looking back. I stood there sobbing, helpless. A few weeks later at midnight, there was a banging on our door. My handsome, wonderful father was arrested and taken away. Not long after the ghetto was liquidated. That day will be etched in my mind forever. The SS troopers invaded early in the morning, their screaming and the sound of their boots filling us with terror. We were told to pack a small suitcase and leave. Small children and the elderly were kept back. My mother and I tried to take my blonde, blue-eyed 5-year-old cousin Jenny with us. When the German beat us, we were forced to leave her in the orphanage. All those left behind in the Krakow ghetto were murdered that night. Without food, without hope, just fear, we marched into another nightmare, Plaszów, a concentration camp just 7 kilometers from the ghetto. It was a sleepy little village with 3 Jewish cemeteries. Some parents hid their small children in backpacks. Only a few of these children were successfully given to the righteous Gentiles. The rest were hidden in barracks, where they knew they were in constant danger and had to keep quiet, no matter how tired and hungry they were. Several months later, our beautiful children were discovered, loaded on trucks, and taken away. We were warned that if we moved, they would be shot. My mother and I built barracks and roads paved with crushed gravestones from the Jewish cemeteries, under the watchful eyes of Amon Ged, a vicious, sadistic murderer. Every second we were in danger of being shot, hanged, or beaten to death. I was struggling just to survive when I first met Oskar Schindler. Schindler was a German industrialist who joined the SS Party just to become rich. Early in 1940, he took over a pots and pans factory in Krakow. Using his charm, he intentionally befriended the SS officer, wined and dined with them, and won their affection with bribes and expensive gifts. This enabled him to get the permits necessary to run the factory and to hire the necessary workers. My mother and I were selected to work for Oskar Schindler, and we moved to the small camp he built for his workers. He paid Amon Get a fortune for this. Her director was our savior, our guardian angel. He had a smile and a kind word for everyone, especially for the children. I was one of the youngest to be lucky enough to be on Schindler's List. Sadly, this heaven didn't last long. Orders soon came to liquidate the camp. When Plaszow was liquidated, Oskar Schindler paid Amon Get a lot of money to move his factory and his workers to Brynli, Czechoslovakia. The men on Schindler's List were shipped in one transport. The women mistakenly ended up in Auschwitz. It was only then that we learned that our children had been taken here and had been murdered on the day of their arrival. It was then that I lost faith in God. Most of us would have died in Auschwitz had not Oskar Schindler rescued us. He sent his beautiful secretary with a fortune in diamonds to bribe the commander. I was among the 300 women who left the death camp. My mother and I survived. Over 6 million others did not. If it weren't for Oskar Schindler, I wouldn't have had a chance to grow up, to get married, to have children and grandchildren. Oskar used his fortune and influence and risked his life to save 1,000 Jews. He and his wife Emily are shining examples that people can make a difference. For years, I couldn't bear to recount my own personal experience. But when the haters in this generation became more violent, and when revisionists began spreading their lies, denying that the Holocaust ever happened, I knew I could no longer remain silent. In 1946, I married Mark Finder, who is also a Holocaust survivor. We have 3 children and 6 beautiful grandchildren.